Hi, this is Paul. The Neil Gaiman story from The New Yorker, Call Me Master, has been obsessing a certain portion of Substack, a portion that I read a fair amount of, and it's been very interesting to follow. And we'll start there, but we're not going to end there. Freddie DeBoer, a Marxist, yet a very interesting writer, wrote a very interesting piece entitled "Maybe This Is Why We Shouldn't Have Published the Andrew Huberman Story," because the idea was, well, if you know they went after Andrew Huberman, and that sort of, well, maybe I should just read part of it. I'm afraid Shapiro's piece does again force me to think about New Yorker's story last year about Andrew Huberman. You could be forgiven for thinking New Yorker's similar story last year about Andrew Huberman, but this would not be a correct characterization. Gaiman is accused of many acts that, if true, rise to the level of sexual misconduct, including rape. And he's saying basically Andrew Huberman just sort of got an attempt to cancel him for being a cad or doing what high status males are able to do, or not making certain women happy, but nothing that would ever show up in court. Now, and then I found a piece by Kat Rosenfield, which was very interesting because she was basically reading it carefully and saying, these women mostly consented on one hand, and upon later reflection removed their consent. Obviously, this paradigm imposes a very weird circular trap on men. #believe women, except the ones who say they want to sleep with you, in which case you should commence a Piro-style interrogation until she breaks down and confesses that she actually finds you repulsive. But I'm more interested in what happens to women when they're cast in the role of society's unreliable narrators, so vulnerable to coerce, so socialized to please, and even the slightest hint of pressure causes instantaneous and irretrievable loss of their agency. The thing is that if women can't be trusted to assert their desires or boundaries because they invariably lie about what they want in order to please other people, it's not just sex they can't reliably consent to. It's medical treatments, car loans, nuclear non-proliferation statements. Our entire social contract operates on the premise that adults are strong enough to choose their choices, no matter the ambient pressure from horny men or sleazy used car salesmen or power-hungry ayatollahs. If half the world's adult population are actually just small beings, hapless, helpless, fickle, fragile, and much too tender to perform even the most basic self-advocacy, everything starts to fall apart, including the entire feminist project. You can't have equal equality for women while also letting them duck through the trapdoor of, but I didn't mean it, like children when their choices have unhappy outcomes. This was followed by Mary Harrington's Manic Pixie Dream Girl Nightmare. The disposition was identified by Red Scare podcaster Anna Kachian, who posted, "I'm really not defending Neil Gaiman. He seems like a pathetic old pervert who did it to himself by seeking out ambulance-chasing bipolar disorder art hoes." Mary Harrington goes on, "Bipolar disorder art hoe is an unkind descriptor, but it is also a succinct characterization of what living poetically often looks like from the outside, as embodied in a common female archetype. If the bipolar disorder component, as in borderline personality disorder, describes the emotional liability of such young women who typically oscillate between exultant emotional heights, bleak melancholy, and wrenching emotional drama, art denotes their tendency to cluster in creative demi-mundane circles among writers, creators, filmmakers, and the like, and Ho describes this character's typical prettiness, propensity for intense interpersonal connection, and tendency to be sexually open to the point of self-destructiveness. A less contemptuous term from this archetype might be one coined by movie critic Nathan Rabin. to describe one of her common cinematic incarnations, the manic pixie dream girl. Perhaps the most canonic such figure is Holly Golightly in Breakfast at Tiffany's, but there are many more. And yet this term doesn't tell us much, for even though cinema tends to be more sympathetic in portraying the manic pixie dream girl than the dismissive borderline personality disorder art hoe, her cinematic incarnations not to grant her much in her life. Instead, she's usually there mostly as a foil for the male movie protagonist's personal development. Now, Harrington's piece is really a good piece because she's basically, we have this whole wave of enchantment going on right now. Everybody's excited about enchantment. Paul Kingsnorth says, whoa, we might want to go a little easy on that word. And I think Kingsnorth is onto something because, well, what Mary Harrington points to is that Gaiman and his wife are basically the high priest and the priestess. And, high priests getting what they want in terms of a woman's body in maybe not a temple, but some exclusive pad filled with all of his enchanted art. That's a very old story. But of course, one person you can't not read is Louise Perry on these things. And Louise basically goes through her history of working in a rape victims program and basically says, there's a lot of girls out there that are going to be vulnerable. And really, what we probably have to do is ask ourselves, what kind of society do I want? She quotes Rosenfeld, the part that I read. The point is well taken, perhaps conceding that some women are too tender to perform even the most basic self-advocacy could lead to conclude that all women should be assigned a legal status close to that of children. That is the historical norm after all. As one Twitter anon quipped in response to this piece, women accidentally reverse-engineered the foundational axiom of gender relations in every civilization that ever existed prior to 100 years ago. I could wiggle out of this quandary by doing as many conservative commentators doing, suggesting that we backpatter ever so slightly, perhaps to the 1980s or 1990s when the full effect of the Second Reformation had yet to hit us. The easy option is to argue for some kind of squishy centrism, a compromise between feces-eating, BDSM, consent culture, and the repeal of the 19th Amendment. But I have a more divisive suggestion than that. After many years of adjusting the matter with my eyes wide open to the trade-offs, I've concluded that some kind of Christian sexual ethic is the best hope we have for protecting girls like Jane. Jane is a girl that she described that she had met in her work earlier, who basically didn't really have the mental capacity to navigate a world of manipulative, deceitful, sleazy men. What Kyle Harper had described in his first sexual revolution emerged in a slave society in which the Roman men enjoyed unrestricted sexual access to the body of their social inferiors, including children, and murdered infants were understood as an acceptable consequence of the need for frequent male sexual release. The violation of slaves and other low-born people was simply, as Harper put it, beyond the field of vision for ancient thinkers. All legal systems, including the Roman ones, have some concept of rape as forbidden sexual violation, but rape was normally a crime that can be committed only against some categories of women, typically only those whose male kin are inclined to object to the offense, and able to punish the perpetrator. The poor and friendless have no such recourse, and they are thus defined as unrapeable. The moral innovation of Christianity was to reconceptualize rape as a moral wrong done to the woman herself, regardless of her birth. Paul's prohibition of, to use the Greek term porneia, that is, illicit sexual activity, including prostitution, upended an ethical system in which male access to the female body was unquestioned and unquestionable. Whereas the Romans regarded male chastity as profoundly unhealthy, Christians prized it and insisted on it. You can go back to my conversation with Sam and Laura about, was the early church sex positive? Early converts were disproportionately female because the Christian valorization of weakness offered obvious benefits to the weaker sex, who could, for the first time, demand sexual continence of men. Feminism is not opposed to Christianity. It is its descendant. Where Christianity diverged from other systems of sexual regulation is in demanding chastity of women and also of men. It imposes restrictions on women, of course, even the women who are intelligent and sane enough to not need them, perhaps. And I'm not saying that of women, certain men. Well, one of the things about Christianity is it also put them on men who needed them. But it is also insists that the likes of Neil Gaiman can't hide their evil desires behind the rhetoric of consenting adults. Yes, I know that the Magdalene laundries, I know about the Catholic abuse scandal, I know what Christian men have committed all sorts of atrocities over centuries. Christians are sinners too. The church has a lot to say on this point. But what Christianity offers, including to non-believers, is an inherently coherent moral system that stood the test of time in a way that, I'm all right, Jack, liberalism never could. Reactionary feminism, which is actually Christian feminism of a kind, opts for sexual repression of both sexes, not out of the hatred of women, but out of the love for girls like Jane. Now, I don't think we're about to get any of this in a Trump executive order. Sorry, it's not coming. When I posted when I first found the Kat Rosenfeld, I posted it on Voices. One voicer sent me this article from a book by Christine Embla, an interview that she did about a year ago of her, the book that she wrote, Rethinking Sex. And I read through, and of course, certain kinds of things catch my attention. Do you view this is Sean Ealing, who's interviewing her. Do you feel your views on sex are necessarily anchored in your Christian perspective? Interesting question. The answer is yes. I converted to Catholicism my senior year of college, and I found that the Catholic Church had a much stronger philosophical and theological backdrop and a grounding in a tradition of thinking practically and spiritually about sex. Not just questions of sex itself, but all kinds of questions around sex and how it relates to the Christian faith. But I didn't write this book necessarily for Catholic readers or for my priest to read. I was writing the book in response to many people I asked, both religious and non-religious, who felt that they were existing in a culture of sexual malaise and weren't sure what to do about it. And they were trying to figure out how to address some of these questions and come up with a better sexual ethic. So I assumed this book came out before Louise Perry's book, but again, seemed to be barking up the same tree. But as with videos and just about everything else, not all books are going to get the same amount of exposure. Now, you might, at this point, quite reasonably imagine that the main issue behind this video is sex and marriage, but it is actually more to do with the nature of the church. Because one of the things that we talked quite a bit about in the live stream today, which I thought was spectacular. I loved the live stream that we did on the Emergent Church, and I loved the participation of all of the guests in that, and I learned a ton from them. But I probably owe the biggest debt to CW, because CW said a number of things that sort of gelled in my mind. All right.
Telling from Bible college that I wanted to do some kind of non-institutional church experiment, and she just looked at me and then was like, "The Emergent Church is already doing that." Like, and ever since then, I've resented them so deeply. Like, you have no idea.
All right. Do you now that's your introduction, do you have anything you'd like to pitch to the group? A proposal you'd like to put on the table? A saucy idea that will make all of us say, "Oh."
Well, I noticed that you don't seem to pitch. I don't know if that was true in this case because I was
Well,
a
it
little late.
depends because Sam didn't pitch. I might feel the need, but
I think you should. I think, but along the lines of what Tripp was saying, I mean, I'm kind of like full disclosure. I'm kind of like in this radical Kierkegaardian place in my life now. And I don't know if that's because of like passing through the immersion church or trying to integrate in both like an Orthodox Presbyterian church and a mainline Presbyterian church. So something there has messed up my brain or something. But I tend to think of like all institutional churches within Christianity as maybe more properly understood as parachurch organizations. So in a way, I've kind of like deeply imbibed the ethos of something of emergent church, even though they were kind of like, the basement dwellers of Big Eva or something, perhaps. But but yeah, I think that the institution is something the church does and not something it is. And so along the lines of what Tripp was getting at, I think the larger question I wonder for unironically Christian people in this cultural moment is what is the underlying unity that serves as a kind of identifiable continuity in all this diverse Christian stuff, whether it be like the formal, speculative, in my view, theological product, or the socio-cultural phenomenon of how we practice our faith. Like, what is the continuity? What's the underlying unity? Or maybe a skeptic might ask, is there a there? That's what I'm interested in.
okay. And we picked up this thread a number of times, and I hope to have enough time to sort of go through the video and maybe isolate some of these threads. The Peugeot thread, which grabbed early on, that won the vote, but don't think it dominated the conversation. Now, before the Northwestuary, we had a talk with the main speakers. We did a little video, and I could look it up and find it, but I remember it okay. I believe I might remember it wrong. Chad corrected me. I had exactly which bus trip in Chino I sat next to Chad, and where we had our little conversation about communion and the TLC. And Chad, I'm sure Chad was right and I'm wrong. But storytellers sometimes use a little license. But I remember Michael Martin. We were talking about church fathers. And Michael Martin basically said, and he was right, he said, a lot of these church fathers, not all, a lot of these church fathers, they're just kind of writing to other academics. They're just writing back and forth. And when I talked to Father Connor McDonough, and he's writing about, he's studying, he's reading 10th century Irish monastics and their theological reflections, those aren't going out directly to people via Substack or YouTube or even publishing. So what's interesting about the Emergent is that the Emergent, as Christian Baxter rightly said, was sort of blogging and publishing. And I think for that reason, I mean, the TLC is just kind of YouTube and conferences and Estuary and Twitter a little bit, maybe a few other platforms a little bit. But my question for Father Connor was, to what degree did that trickle down into the church where normal people were? Now, obviously, a big revolution of this was the printing press. It's helpful to remember that in some places, now it's difficult to talk, the Roman Catholic Church has long been a diverse thing, but in some places, there was active resistance to getting Bibles in the hands of people. Wycliffe Bible translators today are, of course, all over the world, translating for tiny little tribes, trying to get the Bible into the language of every people group. And the reason it's named after Wycliffe was because Wycliffe was persecuted for making a version of the Bible for regular folk. And so there's long been this tension in the church. So when Christine Elba talks about Roman Catholic sexual teaching, well, sexual teaching, especially, John Paul II, that very much came down into the church. And when we have this video with me and Sam and Laura about was the early church, or was the was the historic church sex positive, certainly stuff was trickling down into the people. But again, many church fathers, these church fathers that are now sort of even sometimes, esteemed, perhaps in the minds of some even fetishized, these are academics writing to each other. Some of them weren't. Some of them were active bishops who were preaching. Of course, Chrysostom has, tons and tons of sermons, as does Augustine. But without the printing press, it's amazing that we have enough manuscripts to actually reproduce these things. But of course, nowhere near the same number of manuscripts that we have of the Bible. The manuscript history of the Bible is absolutely astounding. I'm not going to use 100% or any kind of language like that, but I'll just say that the manuscript tradition of the Bible is unparalleled in the ancient world for such an ancient document, compared to the numbers of documents we have about all other sorts of things, of which there's just handfuls of copies available. So, and this gets me to think about church and how church functions and the form of it. Because if you think about, let's say, how church functioned, let's think about Paul's, we know so little about the very early church. I mean, we have the epistles in the New Testament, but we're so desperate to know what was happening down below. And throughout most of the history of the church, the majority of it is just sort of in the dark, and historians do the best they can. But compared to what we have today, so the video I released this morning was the question about just, Protestantism everywhere. And we talked about that on this live stream as well, where in America, people are choosing. They're choosing Orthodoxy, or choosing Catholicism, or choosing various flavors within that. And of course, Protestantism is just this absolute smorgasbord of options. And yet people regularly look around their city and they say, I can't find a church that fits. And you have pressures from above and pressures from below, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this question, what exactly is the church and what do we mean by it? And how do we talk about it? Now, one of the things that is happening today, because we have so many people who are so well educated, is that everybody's, how many Substacks are out there being written by Christian people for Christian people about Christian things that are, this is basically the argument that went on when women's bloggers began, like in the aughts. And people began to ask, these women's bloggers have enormous influence in the church. We talked about this in this conversation too, because, okay, so maybe you're going to your Catholic church for your sacrament, but maybe it's actually Trent Horn or Pints from Aquinas or how many other Catholic YouTubers that are actually doing the heavy lifting of formation in terms of the stuff between your brain. Maybe I'll find that portion of this conversation too.
I think that's has it been? I mean, I'm generally curious. Like
this was Tripp asking me about the TLC and me talking about the fact that is estuary an evangelism program? I think it's actually, now that we've been doing it for a while, I think it's more of a pastoral care program that has evangelistic possibilities. But what I really saw is people needed a space. I made this really short video from a thing that Bethel McGrew sent me. One of the most painful frustrations about these conversations, he's talking about this video with Spencer Clavin and Jordan Peterson. One of the most painful frustrations about these conversations is the inability to actually participate in them. The fact is that they are having a dinner scene is an equally apropos metaphor. In recent years, I completed my master's degree in philosophy, mainly because I thought perhaps then people will be willing to have conversations with me about big questions. I am finding that is not at all the case. The harder I studied, the less and less anyone wanted to have any conversation with me. Now I am reduced to just watching videos like this one and writing in my journal. If you watch this video after having not eaten all day, you'll get a sense of what I mean. I am the street urchin with his nose pressed into the window watching two learned men inside the house glut themselves on a feast of the intellect and the soul. I can see the food, I can even smell it, and imagine its taste on my tongue, but alas, it only increases the grumbling of my stomach. Where were we?
Is this like a pipeline then? Like, have you seen people like come to Estuary first and then eventually get plugged into a church? Or are they still kind of on the periphery? Because I get it's hard, right? Because they have opinions, like institutions don't bend easily to independent thinkers. So
I think most are still, I mean, for some people, and Sherry says it at the Olympia conference, and she asked me on stage, I'm like, oh, Sherry, don't ask me that question. Is Estuary church? I have my own institutional orthodoxy confessional line. Estuary is church adjacent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Because it is.
Mm-hmm.
And but at the same time, it is pastoral care, but it is also seeker oriented in that people in my estuary, they might not stay for 11 o'clock, but they're sitting in there with other Christians and with non-Christians. They're talking about this stuff. And a lot of them are like, I sort of understand the church a little bit better now. I never really had any idea what that thing was for or why anybody tolerated it. So it is having some impact. And it's very clear that the YouTube presence, the Peterson Peugeot, and to a degree the PVK pipeline, has brought a lot of people into church, because we saw that in the Discord, and I continue to get letters now that I'm going to church now. But even when we're in the Olympia conference, many people at that conference, because of this pipeline, have been going to church, but they're uneasy at church. And another video I have cooking is, there's a lot of people who are like, well, they've started going to church, and so maybe they're doing the liturgy if they're Orthodox, if they're going to Catholic, or they're doing the Mass, but they're still not quite sure what they're doing there.
Yeah. If I hadn't grown up going to church, and if I hadn't continually kept going to church, and I was a TLC person who had been pushed and encouraged to start going to church or of basically whatever kind, I probably would have found it lame after a while, because I feel like almost none of my TLC self is very activated in an average church service. And I've been to a lot of different kinds of churches in the past couple of years, and that's true of all the different ones. And I feel like I'm operating on the older code that I know from childhood when I'm in those churches. And that if I were just there for TLC motivations, that I would probably get tired of it and not find what I was looking for and probably burn out.
I guess that's a good, I think that's a good point, Sam. I guess two questions. One, should we want your TLC mode to be activated during church? And then two, like if you've never had that kind of like background, how would we ease you into just letting that part of yourself go if your answer to the first part is no, you don't need to be your TLC self in church, because that's not
if the sermon felt more like some of the podcasts that I liked, that would probably be true. But there is like a taste of the worldview gap is tasteable, noticeable between say the average sermon and a collection of your favorite TLC-ish sort of pseudo sermons or sermons. So I think that would help. And if most of the people there, I felt like I could connect with them like I do when I'm at a Chicago estuary meetup, whatever we are group. I felt like I had that sort of community. I would probably feel it that way, but I feel like I'm terrified to talk about TLC things in church. Part of that is just because it's me, but part of that is because like if I were to bring up Jordan Peterson or anything that could smack of something like that, it could have a really negative effect on a lot of relationships.
Okay, Sam, the reason all that is, to go way back to what was what's his name? The guy who was at your meetup a long time ago, started the BOM with Joey. What the heck's his name? Anderson. What's his name?
Oh, Tyler.
Tyler.
Now married with a baby.
Yeah. So Tyler said that a lot of what church has been is a masculine space with feminine language when it should be a feminine space with masculine language. And here's the thing, church, they tell you they want to know what you think and they want to have robust intellectual conversations, but bullshit, they don't, because they don't really want to know what you think. Because if they really know what you think, it might unsettle the literal basis of modern institutions and they will collapse, because all of a sudden you're going to get out of the groupthink and things aren't going to go well. So you can only do it here because we don't have those stupid confessional boundaries.
Well, which is why...
And the people in the comments saying, I just want to go to a mass and I just want it to be blah, 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 blah. What you're basically saying is, I want to turn off culture basically of the church while I'm there altogether, so that so I don't go to a church with a conflicting culture to what I feel from my TLC culture. If I just
or you want to shut off your mind.
Right. Yeah. I want to shut off that so that I can still be full TLC and just like hear some songs and look at pretty paintings. But I think that most people still want something even more than just that.
Right. Or Andrew Sullivan. So I want to go to my Catholic church. I want to be gay married. I'd love to be gay married in my Catholic church, but I can't. But I'm going to go to my Catholic church. I'm going to go to my mass. I'm going to pick my priest carefully because I'm a famous person and get that done. And so everyone's mixing and matching. So Trent, this is where today's video, Trent Horn is my Protestant preacher, but I go to Catholic for mass and I'm a good Catholic. Well, where is Trent Horn in the hierarchy? And so what exactly is that Catholic church, or is CW finally right? And the Catholic church is just a parachurch.
I think there are at least two unexamined underlying assumptions that are crippling our ability to even talk about these things. And it seems to me that one of them we've already touched on, which is the almost ubiquitous and universal assumption that the church is to be unproblematically identified with an institution. And it strikes me that, regardless of the house church movement, emergent experimentation, TLC, yada, 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 that for many people is still very much live and controlling in their thought of what church is. So that's one of them. And then the other one, I think, is the capitulation or conflation of all Christian thought with theological hegemony or theological method, that there is no Christian thought apart from a theological mode of analysis. Well, therefore, you have to choose. You have to choose which school. You can't think in light of your Christian convictions until you've resolved that question. Well, so that's a big unresolved problem.
So shutting off your brain is not an option, and just going and doing the ritual.
Right.
It isn't if you're going to live out your faith. And this was my problem with the whole, and he's abandoned this now, but this is my problem with the whole Vervaekeist religion that's not a religion. Because the obvious equivocation to me signaled, some cute polemic for something like religion without a theology. Well, that's very attractive to people until they want to think about it. What the hell am I doing? Why am I doing it? Well, that's, theology is helpful then. But so if you have this absolutist mindset that, that theology is not a pragmatic speculative device to help me make sense of what I'm doing in my religion, but it is the only way that I can approach religious thought, you get into this quagmire. And I see this in all these incoherences, even in this discussion. I see Tripp, who is in my mind, fixated on movement Christianity and who's up and who's down. Then meanwhile, he balks at the suggestion that the emergent church still has people they could serve. But look at Paul. Paul, who you love, Tripp, he's a failed pastor. He's a failed pastor who
with
has
ADHD.
not given up on loving his people. That's the difference. That's the only difference.
I think I figured
Not
out
to pick on you,
MJ is
not to
actually CW. MJ is is a burner
Oh,
account.
no.
Of
This is
CW.
this is so fascinating because you have successfully defeated a position I've never held, and like I do not think that Paul is a failed pastor in any way, shape, or
No,
form.
that's my view. That's my view.
Okay, well that's not my view at all. So like that's you are arguing against a position that I've never.
I disagree with Paul about that too. Yeah.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I mean, at some point we are like abstracting out what does even the emergent church mean, right? Like we don't know. Like I mean, it is like we are like kind of it is a fuzzy term. We don't know. Ones don't like we don't know. Is John Piper part of the the emergent church? Is Tim Keller? Is Mark Driscoll? Like if Rob Bell? Like okay, like we get it. These are fuzzy terms. That's fine. I think that we can all, though, agree that there was a thing that was happening in the mid 2000s to the mid 20 teens that was different, that was outside of normal institutional bounds of denominations like the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCUSA, the Episcopal Church, the like Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, those kind of things. There was something different that was happening in a non-denominational bounds that was different, and there were different factions with them, and part of them like just ceased going to church altogether. Other ones joined more conservative denominations.
Again, a church institution. I mean, again, like you can't get away.
No. I'm sorry. I'm not going to play that game. No.
You have you don't have a choice.
There are church denominations. There are church denominations. I'm not going to like say that the I'm a good Protestant. I
don't dispute that. I'm not trying to say that institutions.
No, so like I'm not saying the church denomination is the church writ large. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is that there were like that movement within the church writ large, like had some spectacular successes and also some spectacular failures.
Okay, we got the part earlier with the question of the church because, and I think CW's asking a penetrating question here because okay, how do we exactly identify this thing? So church fathers, Origen, at some point, is he out or is he in? Maximus, he was declared a heretic at one point, but and of course you've got the papacy to consider because the whole question of the papacy and how that impacted the relations between the Greek church and the Latin church, and of course the papacy with respect to the Protestant church. And Sarah had made a great point where, basically liturgy sort of replaces confession. And I remember one person who is now sort of mainline, argued that, well, liturgy was sort of what kept, in high churches, it's the liturgy that holds them together. But you can watch Protestia on YouTube and see some pretty wacky liturgies in some mainline churches. So, and is liturgy, because of course, I've made this point before, for the Roman Catholics, it's the Eucharist, the Eucharist, the Eucharist. For the Orthodox, it's the liturgy, the liturgy, the liturgy. For the Protestant, it's the preaching of the word, the preaching of the word. And I would argue that we're now looking in an area where it's the communion of the saints, because Christine Elba says, well, Roman Catholic teaching. Okay, but what's the relationship between Roman Catholic teaching and the practice of the vast majority of American Catholics? Which is why a lot of Catholics are like, no, we want real Catholics, so we're going to go to one with a traditional Latin Mass, or we're going to have a really conservative bishop, and you've got an Episcopal bishop giving a sermon that suddenly makes headlines because Donald Trump is there. And other people saying, hey, how would it have been if a Roman Catholic clergy had given a sermon against abortion to Biden? And, I still remember Ronald Reagan, who didn't go to church, and that back in the 80s was sort of a big deal because, of course, Jimmy Carter, who just recently passed away, was someone who clearly participated regularly in his Baptist church. And for Reagan, Nancy's reading astrology, and Reagan's like, well, that would put people at risk. And then there was George W. Bush's church attendance. Nobody's, Aaron Wrenn writes I thought, a really good piece where he said, in many ways, Trump is really our negative world post-Christian, our first negative world post-Christian president. No one is expecting Donald Trump to go to church on a regular basis. He didn't go to church before. And J.D. Vance is a Roman Catholic. Kamala Harris, not sure what church, but even again, it would have been, there was an expectation that American presidents went to church. And now we're in this space where, I think it came up in this really good interview with Louise Perry again. Now, the section I'm remembering is with Louise Perry and Paul Seabright. But the portion is not in the video that's on YouTube. It's in the audio podcast that if you're a subscriber, you get access to. And there's often some good stuff in the part that doesn't make the YouTube interview. Louise and her husband that are putting this thing together, where Paul Seabright basically talks about pick and mix religion. And he says, we're going to see a lot more of this pick and mix religion. And that's exactly what we're seeing now. So you get a lot of your mental teaching and theology from YouTube. And again, if you're getting it from YouTube, especially if you're, you got Bishop Barron, so there you got somebody who's ordained. You got a few other Roman Catholic clerics out there, and Bishop Barron is sort of the big one, at least in my opinion, to my knowledge. But with Protestants, you're more likely to get it from a preacher, ironically, given the ecclesiology. Orthodox, of course, Orthodoxy is on YouTube big time, but the questions are going to be about very much what CW asks in terms of what is the through line of the church. And we've seen this in the United States for a long time with the rise of nominalism, how many people identify as Christian but never darken the door of a church. Nathan comes on, after I drop the link, and is asking about data. And as I say later on, most people who are not in church leadership have zero idea about just how closely the church studies itself, especially in the seeker movement. Endless survey after survey, customer satisfaction surveys. But the more you lean into that kind of data collection, the more you realize just how difficult it is. And Nathan says about predictive capacity. Again, it's sort of what everybody's seeking, but the realm of religion is just so massive and mysterious that the predictive capacity is almost always wrong, even though it is studied enormously, and many, especially Protestant evangelical clergy, read these things. I got to get out of here. Time is late. So this is just one of these areas that's just an ongoing. It's just what I think about. It's just what I think about. So leave a comment. Let me know what you think.